God bless you. This is Dr. Dale Sides. I've got a good word to share with you today, something very exciting and something you don't know. Enlightenment, huh? I want to share with you today about the birth of the patriarch Abraham, and particularly the astronomy of his birth sky. Isn't it interesting that the Bible doesn't start talking about Abraham till he's 75 years old, and yet here he is, perhaps the most important and pivotal man in all history. 3 major world religions have sprung forth from his loins, 2 of them physically and 1 spiritually. And he is such a great patriarch, and he's even mentioned in the Quran. And there's a lot of details about Abraham's life that by the grace of God was covered in history. So why the Bible chose to pick him up at 75, that's God's business. But you know, when you look at the Bible, the first 11 chapters of Genesis covers the first 2,000 years of mankind's history. Well, the next 12 chapters dealing with Abraham's life covers the next 175 years. So there was as much emphasis and attention given to Abraham as there was to the entire beginning of the Old Testament up until the time that he was born. Very, very important and pivotal man. And whenever I began sharing with you some of these things I'm going to in this sharing, in this teaching, it's exciting to know this and very pivotal in understanding what really made Abraham the great man that he was is the background that he came from before he was called at 75. Let's backtrack and let's talk about Abraham's birth and how I know what I'm going to teach you today. The books Jubilees, Jasher, and Josephus are historical records that contain great annals of truth about Abraham that perfectly coincides with the Bible. And I have gone through and studied these extensively and actually put together an entire timeline of Abraham's life, constructing these together. And it's very, very exciting to find out the interaction that Abraham had with Nimrod. And he was born during a very bloody time of Nimrod's conquest to conquer the world. And so Abraham, let's just say he's the 10th son from Noah, who was the 10th from Adam, or Abraham was the 20th generation from Adam. He was the 20th generation from Adam. So what we want to do is pick up his life historically, and the book of Jasher gives amazing details of Abraham's life, as does Jubilees, as does Josephus. But weaving them together has been the joy and privilege of my research. But I want to present to you today his birth and his birth sky, because in studying this and finding this record, and I'm going to the book of Jasher chapter 8. I'll talk to you about Jasher in just a moment. But in Jasher chapter 8, it gives a record of astronomical phenomenon that chronicled Abraham's birth that allows us now to accurately put a date in the Old Testament dating that has been lost due to the fraudulent perversion of the Masoretic texts. And most every English-speaking Bible that we use today has been perverted by the Masoretic text. However, Abraham, the son of Terah, the 10th from Noah, was born on February 27th in the year 1953 BC. Now, say February 27th, it could have been anywhere between the 27th of February and the 5th of March. But there's such an amazing, phenomenal thing took place, and it's recorded in the book of Jasher. Now, Jasher, Jubilees, and Josephus are quite old, but in doing the research for this, I consider the age of each of them. And Jasher is actually mentioned in the book of Joshua in chapter 10, verse 13, and also referenced in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 18. So Jasher is a very, very valid historical reference. It is not scripture, but in hermeneutics. And when you're studying truth and rightly dividing the word of truth, when you see truth that we declare written in the Bible, when you see other facts that agree with it, then you can consider those as ground for truth as well. So when you look at the book of Jasher and Jubilees and Josephus in light of the Bible and the Quran, in light of the Bible, then you realize that these historical books are of great value. So let me tell you about the birth of Abraham. Abraham's father, Terah, was a big official in the kingdom of Nimrod. Now, Abraham's father, Terah, his father, Nahor, was a major prince in Nimrod's kingdom. And Terah was chief among the astrologers, and this was in Abraham's bloodline. So when Abraham was born, the night Abraham was born, there was a group of conjurers and astrologers and mighty men of Nimrod's kingdom that had come down to Terah's house to celebrate the birth of Abraham. I'm going to read this to you out of Jasher chapter 8 and in verse 1. And it was in the night that Abram was born that all the servants of Terah and all the wise men of Nimrod and his conjurers came and ate and drank in the house of Terah, and they rejoiced with him on that night. Book of Jasher chapter 8, okay? And all the wise men and the conjurers went out from the house of Terah. They lifted up their eyes toward the heavens that night to look at the stars, and they saw, and behold, one very large star came from the east and ran in the heavens and swallowed up all the four stars from the four sides of the heavens. Quite a phenomenal event. And now, because of our computer technology and the accuracy of the ephemerides and the movement of the planets, we can reconstruct this time and find the exact date that this took place when Abraham was born. As I said, February 27th, in all likelihood in the year 1953 BC. And all the wise men of the king and his conjurers were astonished at the sight, and the sages understood this matter, and they knew its importance. Can I stop for a second and share something with you? One of the reasons I wanted to share this teaching with you is because I have had it within my heart and have worked with individuals through the years to reconstruct Christological astronomy, to be able to interpret what someone's birth sky says accurately and not according to astrology. When I saw what this celestial phenomenon displayed about Abraham's birth, I knew beyond a doubt that we had tapped into the accurate keys of interpreting Christological birth skies. You know why? Because I could have interpreted Abraham's birth sky the same as the wise men did at the time of his birth, which showed us that we were on the right track in our interpreting of Christological astronomy birth skies. So this says, it continues on, and they said, this only betokens the child that has been born to Terah this night, who will grow up and be fruitful and multiply and possess all the earth, he and his children forever, and he and his seed will slay great kings and inherit their lands. And they spoke, and the wise men and the conjurers went home that night, and in the morning all these wise men and conjurers rose up early and assembled in an appointed house, and they spoke and said to each other, behold, the sight that we saw last night is hidden from the king. It has not been made known to him. And should this thing get known to the king in the latter days, he will say to us, why have you concealed this matter from me? And then we shall all suffer death. Therefore now let us go and tell the king the sight which we saw and the interpretation thereof, and we shall there remain clear. So when they came to before Nimrod and they told Nimrod this, they told Nimrod that the child born to Terah was destined to rule the world, and that his seed would slay kings, and that he would be a major patriarch in the world kingdoms. Well, Nimrod decided to have the child killed. And this begins the saga of Abraham's life, interweaving with Nimrod and his going into exile. For the first 50 years of his life, Abraham was in exile and did not live with his father Terah. From the time he was 10 years old to the time he was 40, he lived with the great patriarchs Noah and Shem, and therefore was trained in the information and knowledge of what happened on the other side of the flood. And that's the only reason we have it now, is because Abraham got it from Noah and passed it to his children, along with the language of Enoch, which is Hebrew, that God gave to the patriarch Enoch, is the first written language. The history in the book of Jasher is just fantastic. However, to continue this saga, Terah then substituted a servant's child and gave it to Nimrod, and Nimrod killed a child thinking that it was Abraham, and Abraham was put in exile. I'm not going to give you his entire life story here, but he lived with Noah till he was 50. He came back to his father's house at that time and had a huge confrontation with his father and with Nimrod over the worshiping of idols. And you'll have to read my book I'm writing on the lifetimes and lessons of Abraham the Patriarch, because Abraham actually was thrown into a fiery furnace by Nimrod. This is long before it happened to Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This happened to Abraham. He stayed in the furnace for 4 days and preached to people and told Nimrod he was a fool and crushed Nimrod's kingdom and the stronghold he had over people. A major point of Abraham's life historically was his interweaving and his defeat of Nimrod. So back to his birth and his birth sky. I want to show you on these slides what these wise men, these conjurers, and these astrologers saw when Abraham was born. What it was the planet Venus. And Venus is one of the inner planets, and it moves very rapidly. As a matter of fact, it moves more rapidly than any of the other planets aside from Mercury. But what happened in this particular configuration is an astronomical phenomenon, because it eclipsed or passed by all 4 major stars, and it did it within a 5-day period. This is unheard of. Well, first of all, to pass these major stars, these are the planets in our solar system. Jupiter, that passed first, then Mercury, then Mars, and then Saturn lastly. But he did this within 5 days. Now, the planet Venus, first of all, this happened in the first month of the year, which shows the importance of Abraham being a patriarch and bringing new light into the world. But Venus is the bright and morning star. It's the brightest. It's the one that you see more predominantly than anything besides the sun or the moon. And it was traveling at such a high rate of speed it was moving, it passed by Jupiter first. Now, first of all, let me tell you, Venus means what you're really known for. So this was saying that Abraham would be a brilliant light to the world, and that he would be an ensign of the Messiah, that he would be an example and an ambassador of righteousness, and he would be a representative in the bloodline of the Messiah. All this was told by Venus. When it passed by and eclipsed Jupiter, Jupiter is the king planet, showing, and I have these charts here to show you when this happened. This happened on the 22nd of February. When it passed by and eclipsed Jupiter, Jupiter is the king planet, and this shows that Abraham's leadership would be championed all over his life, over his entire life, and in the influence of his kingdoms of the world, and it certainly was. And then as it passed by, it eclipsed Mars. And Mars is the warrior planet, and this shows that Abraham would not only be a great leader, but he'd be a great warrior. And what many people don't realize about Abraham is this. You're going to get a good history lesson here. When Abraham came out of the fiery furnace with Nimrod, and he left to go back to his father Terah's house, where afterwards he married Sarah. When he came out of the fiery furnace, Nimrod, he had 300 men, trained soldiers, that when they saw Abraham embarrass Nimrod to such a great degree, they left Nimrod and followed Abraham. And Abraham had an army of 300 men his whole life. From the time he was 50 years old till the time he died, he kept 300 soldiers at bay. So that's whenever Lot was captured by Chedorlaomer and Nimrod, and they headed off toward Damascus. He gathered his 300 soldiers and 18 neighbors, and they went after them. The greatest military victory in the history of the world. 318 men, over 900,000 men in Chedorlaomer's army. And they did it by angelic power. Nothing new under the sun. Abraham started a lot of these things, but what a mighty, mighty warrior Abraham was. So then, after this, after Venus eclipsed Mars, it passed by Mercury. And the only reason it could do this is because Mercury was in retrograde and moving backwards. Elsewise, Venus would have never caught it. This is no way that this could be reduplicated in any other way. And here it is written in the history books. And we have the exact dating of the birth of Abraham. And so Mercury shows the spokesman that Abraham would be a great preacher of righteousness, and boy, was he ever. And then finally, it passed by an eclipse and caught up with Saturn. And when it caught Saturn, then that was showing that his destiny would be to rule over the kingdoms of the world. This is what the astrologers, the astronomers, and the conjurers told Nimrod. I could have read it as easily as they could, because that's exactly what the birth sky says. Can I say something to you here real quickly? Yours, mine, even Jesus's was not as sensational as Abraham's birth sky. But each one of us have one. And we found Jesus's birth sky on September the 11th in the year 3 BC. And so we now have Old Testament, New Testament datings, and we can again reconstruct accurate chronology of the history of the believers in the Bible. So, having said this now, you see the importance of Abraham's life and in his birth sky. And I wanted to show you this and say this to you too, that your birth sky has great significance about who God has called you to be. He wrote them as signs and seasons and for days and years, as it says in Genesis chapter 1. And the day and year that you were born has great significance as far as what God saw in you when He created you, exactly what He saw in Abraham. Abraham was a great patriarch. He was a great man of God, and he was called by God for a particular purpose. So were you. And your life is very important. And these things that we are looking at and we're understanding about Abraham's life is very important. He was the father of faith. He was the friend of God. And we call him our Father, and we're out of his spiritual loins, then we need to replicate those things that Abraham did. But I wanted to share this with you, show you these slides, these pictures of the birth of Abraham, and tell you without a doubt that on the 27th of February in the year 1953 BC, now on these slides it says 1952, because that comes from Stellarium and compliments of Stellarium. We thank you very much for allowing us and everyone else to use your program. But anyway, that's just the way that Stellarium counts the 0 years. So if you wanted to see 1953, you have to look at 1952. This is exactly what happened in the heavens. Venus passed by and eclipsed all 4 major planets, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, and Saturn, in that order. And that was the birth sky of Abraham. And that's how Nimrod knew that he would be his nemesis and tried to kill Abraham, but he didn't do it. And the big deal is, if you're going to kill the king, you better kill the king. The prophecy was that Abraham or his seed would kill Nimrod. And it ended up happening in the end of Nimrod's life. It was not Abraham that killed Nimrod. It was Esau killed Nimrod. So, history. And the book of Jubilees and the book of Josephus gives tremendous details about Abraham. A great man of sagacity and wisdom and knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, and a great righteous man and a friend of God, a great example for us all to walk in and learn from and walk in the steps of Father Abraham. Hope you've enjoyed the teaching. You've learned something about Abraham and learned something about destiny, and perhaps the importance of God's hand on your life and how you can understand what that means to you. But certainly we can appreciate the life of Abraham and how thankful we are for the historical records in the book of Jasher that allows us to get this specific time dating on the life of Abraham, which will again allow us to reconstruct an accurate chronology of the entire history of the Old Testament and then follow on into the New. God bless you. We've enjoyed the teaching on the birth and birth sky of Abraham the Patriarch.